I think you can look at the border war as having two periods. I don't know that you can draw a neat and distinct line and say this is the first border war and this is the second border war, because I think for the people that lived through the experience, they were intimately connected. One, the first struggle in Kansas over slavery fed into the larger, more consuming conflict that spread into Missouri and took both sides of the border and just really threw them into flames. But I think that you can't see there being two phases, because beginning with the American, the National Civil War, it takes on a new intensity, and it does become a much more devastating conflict. Many more people will die, many more people will suffer, but they are so closely related that I think it's also fair to say that they're all part of a border war, that the Civil War had begun here years before it ever began in Northern Virginia.
In 1854, Missouri is a slave state. The western border is unsettled frontier until President Franklin Pierce signs the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The issue of slavery is left up to a popular vote. The Massachusetts Emigrant Aid Society sends more than 200 free staters to the Kansas Territory to set up residency and to vote against the expansion of slavery. Pro-slavery supporters in Missouri and in Kansas attempt to steer the vote in their own favor, causing the number of votes to outweigh the number of citizens in the Kansas Territory. Nonetheless, a pro-slavery legislature is elected. Free staters view it as wholly illegitimate and their laws as bogus. They quickly form a competing free state legislature, which pro-slavery factions in turn view as illegitimate. Events quickly turn violent. A border war erupts and becomes so hostile that Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune coins the phrase, "Bleeding Kansas." There are murders of individual and groups of free state abolitionists. Skirmishes and small-scale battles involve anywhere from dozens to thousands of men. The Wakarusa War, the sack of Lawrence, the Battle of Fort Titus, the Battle of Osawatomie, a major free state raid into Bates County, Missouri, and the Battle of the Spurs all took place well before the Civil War. On the national level, Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts is beaten on the floor of the U.S. Senate after his speech, "The Crime Against Kansas." Settler John Brown develops a fearsome reputation for attacking pro-slavery settlers and leading several slave raids into Missouri. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected 16th President of the United States. Eventually, abolitionists gain control of the Kansas legislature and draft an anti-slavery constitution. Kansas enters the Union as a free state in 1861, and the Civil War breaks out shortly thereafter.
And what you have is this expansion of the existing border war that up until 1860 had been fought almost entirely on Kansas soil. After 1861, both sides of the border are aflame.
There had been all these years of conflict here in Kansas and Missouri. By the time the Civil War broke out in 1861, Kansas was really a Union-leaning state, and many men did rush into service.
You know, when the war starts, the Union Army basically sweeps into the state. I mean, almost like a blitzkrieg.
One historian has described the Civil War in Missouri as the War of 10,000 nasty incidents, because in many cases it was neighbor against neighbor. It wasn't an organized militia as much as it was guerrillas fighting armies fighting militias, and it gets very messy and very ugly early.
You have Union forces in Kansas who really are official forces, these so-called Jayhawkers. They were raiding into Missouri from Kansas as sort of a bit of a payback from what had happened during Bleeding Kansas. So it was going the other direction. So they were coming into Missouri, they were taking people's things, their property, but they were also, in Missourians' minds, stealing their slaves. Now I think in most cases, Missouri slaves saw people wearing blue uniforms, men wearing blue uniforms, as their liberators.
The Battle of Island Mound, quite simply, was the first active combat experienced by African American soldiers during the Civil War. Many Americans are familiar with the story of the 54th Massachusetts as popularized by the movie Glory. But months before that, African American soldiers, many of them in the 1st and 2nd Kansas Colored, fought a skirmish. And the description of Confederates or pro-Confederate guerrillas who were there today, they fought like tigers. And it is a significant moment in American history.
The guerrillas and the slaveholders, of course, do not want them to join the Union Army, and that becomes a tremendous focus of the guerrilla insurgency.
In the late summer of 1861, Kansas troops under James Lane, the famous general senator, they raid western Missouri and will burn several towns, Harrisonville, Butler, and then finally Osceola.
You can, the military can come through with all of its might, but it's really hard to, in modern day language, to secure the minds and the hearts of the people, to bring them over to your side, especially if you're engaged in what they consider to be abusive policies, which is going and arresting men that they deem disloyal to the Union, taking their property away from them.
It's tricky business trying to break down all of the actors in the Civil War on the Kansas-Missouri border because it's messy stuff. You do have organized regular militia units. You have Union soldiers. You have pro-Confederate secessionist militia, especially in Missouri. But then you have a large number of guerrillas. You have a large number of irregular partisans. And it wasn't always easy to distinguish loyalties. And so even for people living through it, it wasn't always simple to recognize who was on which side.
And so what ends up happening is this just nasty guerrilla warfare erupts in the state and along the border. So it's going over into Kansas as well.
And so many Southern sympathizers in Missouri will begin to support and actively feed and rally behind pro-Confederate guerrillas, commonly called bushwhackers. And this complicates the Union Army's mission in Missouri to keep peace and to keep order. It complicates that mission immensely. And from 1861 to 1863, the Army will fight mightily, but will struggle to contain this guerrilla threat.
The Union Army didn't know how to deal with the situation. It was a mess. It was very violent. It was a scary place to be during the war. And they were desperate to try to contain the situation. Eventually what happens is that the Lincoln and the Army decide that they need a department, a military department that just focuses on the border.
General Ewing was very aware of these guerrilla groups, particularly the ones led by Quantrill. They had already attacked Shawnee in Kansas and Olathe. And so in order to kind of control these sons that felt that they were protecting their homeland, and they were being supported by farmers and farm families and relatives who gave them intelligence and food and shelter. And General Ewing decided he was going to put a stop to this.
General Order Number 10 is passed in early August of 1863, and this calls for the arrest of the mothers and sisters and other female kinfolk of known guerrillas.
But a group of them were arrested because essentially they had a little guerrilla shirt making factory in their parlor. The Union military went to this woman's house because they had heard that she had some stolen material from a merchant, in Shawnee, Kansas. And when they got there, they found that all this material had been converted into shirts, this very sort of distinctive guerrilla style of shirts.
Many of these women will be housed in makeshift jails in Kansas City, including the one that will collapse in mid-August of 1863. And this jail collapse is widely cited as one of the motivations behind William Quantrill's raid upon Lawrence.
A number of the accounts mentioned the saloons being very popular with the raiders. As the violence grew and it became a total any male that was walking by, and I think the violence began to feed on itself. And we know from some modern history that once violence starts and that thin veneer of civilization is removed and people are frightened and they're anxious, and they had ridden all night and they were tired and fatigued, and the ones that had imbibed of the spirits perhaps lost all inhibition, and in total up to 200 men and boys, some as young as 12 and some quite elderly people. It became a total massacre in that 4 hours. I don't think it was planned as a massacre. I think it was one of the kind of things that happen when violence is loosened.
And days after Lawrence, General Thomas Ewing, the commanding Union officer of the District of the Border, realizes that the likelihood of a Kansas reprisal into Missouri, having another massacre carried out upon a Missouri community, is quite high. And having struggled for months and years to deal with the guerrilla threat being abetted by this sympathetic population, Ewing decides to act against the civilians more forcefully than any Union or military commander had done during the war. Order number 11 calls for the ejection, the forcible removal of all Southern sympathizers living in parts of 4 Missouri counties: Jackson, Cass, Bates, and Vernon counties.
And so basically he turned thousands of women and children and elderly people, not men, because, military-age white men, because most of them were gone, so mostly women and children, into refugees, with nothing to their name, and they flee the area.
And once the residents of these counties were left, their homes were plundered, whether by roaming outlaws or by Union troops, and homes were set ablaze, and in the ensuing prairie fires, the entire area, much of the area, was destroyed and quickly earned the nickname of the Burnt District. 150 years have passed now since the start of the Civil War, but it seems apparent if you spend much time talking to people in this area about the Civil War that some measure of bad blood still exists. And as a historian, it's interesting to me because it's not always evident why the bad blood exists. People are aware of the Civil War, and people often are quick to claim sides, whether by heritage, they had someone, an ancestor who fought for one side or another, or they simply are fascinated and passionate about this, but people do choose sides. But I don't know that they're always entirely clear about the complexity and necessarily all of the ugliness on both sides of the state line and both sides of the political divides of that day. But I think hard feelings do persist, for sure.
Here were people that were living on, what was the sort of fault line of America at that time, and they were coming to terms with it. They were having to live it, and I think that's important to understand, not only for American history, but also to again think about more modern wars. How do people confront a guerrilla insurgency? How do people come back together after conflict has occurred? I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from this really interesting period in American history.